Alright, we got a pretty solid animation for all of Spider-Man's body parts. It doesn't look amazing. In fact, it looks really bad right now. The next step is just to go through and scrutinize every little detail of the performance and make minor tweaks to the animations, the poses, and the graph editor until this feels right, until you look at it and you don't go, ugh. I'm gonna go through and do that now. Feel free to skip through this part, but also feel free to stick around if you want to see the little tweaks and details that I add. I feel like if Spider-Man's going to go into cannonball pose, he needs to have his legs kind of kick out with more force to drive him into that rotation. I'm going to do that by having his legs further back at the start of the shot. That feels better. During this movement, I feel like you would have a bit more clockwise rotation going into it, so let's fix that. I'm going to bring back our empty. Actually, rather than adding more Y rotation, maybe we could just subtract some Y rotation from the beginning. There we go. By rotating this keyframe a little bit, we could give a little kick of speed to his turn right there. Alright, that's a little better. Alright, I'm going to go through the animation and add little imperfections to each body part. Just detail of movement, basically. I'm actually going to rotate some of these values and offset them a little bit just to give it some randomness. I feel like we're in a great spot with the animation. Let's take a look. Looks sick. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through and fix all of the weird things that are happening with his body. So you can see right here we got some crazy stretching on his shoulder, which is a little bit alarming. And if you're watching this, the final render, you're immediately going to pick up on that because human brains are so accustomed to what humans look like, so we gotta fix all the little errors. Let's actually change to material preview so we can see how the suit is stretching. You can see we have this weird lump, and we're gonna fix that by using these two circles right here. If you're not seeing those, you can go into the object data and toggle some of the layers, see if you can locate it. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna rotate this a little bit. Maybe even go like that. Cool, that's already way better. Now we can set a location rotation keyframe. Add another one right there. Then when we no longer need it, we can hit Alt-R and Alt-G. Don't really need any, maybe a little bit right there. That's fine. It's gonna get wonky right here. Alright, that's looking much more natural. Sweet, alright, let's go through and do the other arm. With the other... Alright, let's go through and do the other side. Now that we have our body animation done, let's go ahead and animate the hands and the webs. So first, let's animate those thingies. Alright, so now we have our view snapped to this center bone right here, but I want to snap it to the hand, so I'm going to select the hand bone, go up to View, and Align View, View Lock to Active. So now, we're following the hand. So, while he's swinging, probably hand would be in a fist position. So let's go ahead and go over to our object data and bring the thingies back in. And the nice thing about this rig is that you don't need to animate each finger bone individually. You can just animate the top one and the rest will follow it, which is super convenient. Let's change this hand position to more of a fist, like he's holding the web. Sweet, that looks good. So let's grab everything we changed. So that'll be this bone, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. Let's set both location and rotation keyframes for those, as well as for the hand bone. Alright, so right around here he would probably let go, select everything we changed, add another keyframe to the location and rotation, then let's have him let go, and we can just hit Alt-R and Alt-G to reset his hand. And when he goes into somersault position, kind of want to let the fingers relax a little bit, kind of like he's resting them on his body. Sweet. Alright, and once we get to here, he's going to be shooting a web, so let's go ahead and put his hand in web position. I'm going to go ahead and reset all of this stuff for when he's in between movements. And then right here, bring these little suckers in. Looks good to me. Now, immediately after that, let's have his hand return to a fist position, and rather than just rotating all the bones again and spending all that time, we can actually go back to our previous fist and grab all of the keyframes from that and Shift D to bring it over. Fix that a bit. And for when he lets go, we can go ahead and reset everything here. Alright, let's do the other hand. I'm just going to speed through this because it's the exact same process. Sweet, alright. Let's take a look at what we got. Super solid. One thing I like to do to these animations is add little tiny finger movements and different hand poses throughout the animation. It's a small detail, but it really helps add to the realism. Sweet, looks good. The last little thing I like to add is some feet animation, just having those take the physics of the legs, kind of trailing behind the animation of the legs a little bit. So let's go through and do that. If you want to rotate the feet correctly, you press R and then X, X, and then that rotates it along its local X-axis, which is what we want. Alright, now let's move on to the webs. There's a lot of random lines that appear when you do the webs, so I like to make my setup as clean as possible. So let's go ahead and hide the Spider-Man empty, let's hide the Spider-Man path, and let's hide everything in the rig except the hands. New and improved web technique. Let's do it. So, let's start at the beginning here, and let's grab our little wrist bone here, and let's bring our 3D cursor to it so that we can add an object right at that position. So let's press Shift S, cursor to selected, and then I'm going to go out of object mode. I'm going to create a new plane. However, we only need one vertex, so I'm going to go into edit mode, click on one vertex, press Ctrl I to invert the selection, and press X. So now we have this one vertex, which is all we need, and we can snap that to the wrist by pressing Shift S, selection to cursor. Cool. So now we got our wrist vertex. Let's extend it with E, or extrude rather, and let's shift click at the point where we want it to be touching, which is on the building right there, and then we can press Shift S, selection to cursor, and now we have our rough web shape going between Spider-Man and the building. Next, let's select all these vertices by pressing A, and let's subdivide it a few times. What we're going to do is we are going to make a cloth simulation with this web so we get the proper physics. And the way we're going to do that is with hooks and a cloth sim. So let's create our hooks. For our hooks, we're going to create one for the wrist and one for the building. Those are going to be the pins for the cloth simulation, so that in between those two hooks we have the simulation, but the hooks will stick to whatever we want to animate them to. So let's click on the wrist vertex, Control H, hook to new object, And let's do the same for the building vertex. Control H, hook to new object. So now if we go into object mode and we move these empties, you can see that it moves part of the web. So we're going to need to go into the physics properties for this object, and let's add a cloth simulation. However, you'll notice that if we press play, it does not stick to the hooks. So what we're going to need to do is go into edit mode and select each vertex that we need to pin, and then go over to the object data properties, add a new vertex group, so let's call this pin, and hit assign with these two vertices selected. Cool, so now if we go over to the physics settings and we go down to shape, and we can change the pin group to pin. So now if we press play, you'll see that everything's going where it needs to, and we're looking good. Alright, so let's bring everything back in, and what we're going to do is, here, let's get rid of this stuff. What we're going to do is parent this hook to Spider-Man's wrist bone so that the web will follow it. And what we could do is we could just select this and then the wrist bone, hit Control P to parent it directly, but we want to be able to undo the parenting mid-swing. So what we're going to do is use a child of constraint on the empty. So let's go to the constraints tab, add a new constraint, child of, and then we can choose Spider-Man, the rig, and the bone shall be hand FKR because that is the forward kinematics bone for the right hand. So now if we press set inverse, it'll bring it back, and if we hit play, you can see that it flies out of here and is doing its job. Cool. However, this is a loose-ass web, so let's go to the shape settings for our web and change the shrinking factor to something like 0.5. Maybe 1. Sweet. So, to have Spider-Man let go of the web, we can change our shrinking factor, set a keyframe right here, play forward a little bit, and then bring that back down to 0, and now it'll be nice and loose for when he lets go. Cool. Alright, so let's have Spider-Man let go of this web, and how we're going to do that is for our empty in the constraint settings, we are going to animate the influence of the child of constraint, because then we can have him let go of the web. So right here, let's set a keyframe for influence, and then right there, let's change that to 0. Alright, and you'll notice that if we play this, when we take away the influence of the child of constraint, it's shooting back to its original location. So we're going to want to animate where this web is going. So let's set a keyframe right here for location, and another one right here. Let's move it maybe down a little bit. But you'll notice that the web keeps doing the same thing, and that's because Blender has a weird bug where it won't update the physics cache unless you change a physics setting. So let's go over to the physics and let's just change the compression a little bit. Alright, now if we hit render on this, you wouldn't see anything where the web is, so let's add some geometry to it. What we're going to do is we're going to be going into the modifiers. Let's just close all this up, and let's add a screw modifier. Let's change the angle to something like 0.02. If you zoom in here, you can see that that is giving us a little bit of geometry data. If we add a solidify modifier, can give it some thickness. Cool. And then on top of all of that, let's add a subdivision surface, and that will smooth out our web. Sweet. Now we got to remember to bake our animation. So under cache in the physics settings, we can just hit bake. And now we got a sweet looking web. Same process for every other web in this video, so I'm just going to speed through those. Quick note, if you want to animate the web coming out of his wrist, simply take the other empty that the web is hooked to, set a keyframe for the location, and then right when he starts to shoot it, let's bring the cursor to his hand, Set another keyframe. Cool. And now you'll see that before he shoots the web, we got a nice mess of web stuff. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to toggle the visibility for the web so that it's not showing in the other parts of our animation. Let's go up to our collections. Let's make sure we have the disabled in renders and disable in viewports selected. And so now we can set it to be viewable here and then not viewable there. Set keyframes by pressing I. So now if we go forward, you can see that it is not visible until we need it. Another quick tip, if you are at the end of your swing and the web doesn't have enough geometry to flail around and it just stays straight, a thing you can do is right when Spider-Man lets go, you can change the tension by keyframing it from 1 to 0, and that way you have a nice loose web that he lets go of. Alright, congratulations! Spider-Man is now fully animated, and we can start animating the camera and adding things to the scene and making it look pretty, and then hit that render button. Let's do it. For the camera, I like to use a similar technique to how we animated Spider-Man, which is using a path. If we go ahead and bring Spider-Man's path back in here, we can actually use this to help animate the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that, and let's rename it to camera path. Now we can move that back a bit and trim off the ends because we're not going to be following Spider-Man around this corner. And we can just start it right here. Cool. That feels pretty good. So now we can add a new camera. And once again, go over to the constraints settings, add a follow path constraint, and then let's snap to the camera path, and then hit Alt-G. Cool. So now, if we change the offset, we can move our camera along our path, which looks pretty good. And for this next part, I think these buildings are probably going to get in the way, so I'm just going to turn them off for now. We won't need the webs either. Going to turn those off so we have a simple scene to animate with. So let's set that offset to 0. And let's go back to the beginning. And I'm going to set one of my views to be the camera view, just so we can keep an eye on what we're animating. So now, let's rotate this way to point at Spider-Man. And I'm going to bring the buildings back in just for a second to orient the camera. Cool. Set a rotation keyframe, and also an offset keyframe. Then at the end of the animation, we can set this to -100 to complete the camera path. Boom. And let's make sure we're doing this linearly. So now we have a nice consistent speed for the camera. And all we have to do now is rotate the camera throughout the sequence and do a little tweaking of the path to get something nice looking. Let's do it. I feel like this camera is a little bit too telephoto, so I'm actually going to change it to a 24mm camera. That feels a lot better. We've gotten to a pretty good point here, but it's still pretty janky, so I'm going to go through and do some tweaks. Cool. I'm digging it. Now for some final tweaks to the animation. what we're going to do is we're going to smooth out the camera and Spider-Man paths. And we're going to do that by going to the curve settings. And let's just change the resolution here, bring that up a bit, and also bring a bit of smoothing. Cool, let's do the same for the other curve. Change that resolution, smooth it a bit. So now, we have a much smoother animation. And lastly, let's add some randomized rotation to both the camera and Spider-Man's movements, just to give it a bit more imperfection and humanness. So, if we bring back all of Spider-Man's rig, so let's snap our view to Spider-Man. Let's get rid of the buildings, all the animation stuff, camera. Let's start with this arm here. If we go into the graph editor and we take the X rotation, we move it a little bit. Cool, so let's add some randomized motion to that by adding a noise filter. And then increasing the scale a bit. And if we actually go ahead and extend the end of our sequence, we can have Spider-Man just doing that. So let's actually stop him from rotating. If we bring back in our animation stuff, we can go to our empty and just add one more keyframe right there so he just completely stops moving. So now you can see what our randomized movement is doing to Spider-Man. That feels like a little bit too much though, so I'm going to turn the strength down to 0.5. Maybe even 0.3. That feels good. Let's copy that. And looks like the Y rotation could use a little bit as well, but make sure to change the offset so that it's not moving in the exact same time. Cool, that looks good. Let's see if the Z needs it. Sure. Change the offset a bit. Sweet. Now I'm going to go through the whole body, adding randomized noise like this to each body part that I feel like needs it. I'm just going to speed through this. Alright, so now we have our randomized rotation. We can take a look. And it looks super weird here, like Spider-Man is just convulsing. And it's pretty subtle, but in motion, it's very helpful and helps the animation look convincing. Sweet. Alright, it is time to move on to the camera, doing the same technique. So let's just grab the camera here, bring back in our camera. Okay, so let's go to the X, Y, and Z rotation. For the X rotation, I like to have a lot of like shaky up and down motion. I feel like that helps. With a smaller scale. Maybe 0.1. Let's try 0.2. Okay, and for the camera, I actually like to do two sets of noise. One set is kind of like fluid up and down motion, and then the second one is like micro shakes. So for the first one, we can change the scale a bit, turn that up, turn up the strength a bit. Cool, that feels good. Now let's copy and paste that. Let's turn the scale way down, and turn the strength way down. Cool, that feels good. And for the Z, let's do the same. Change the offset a bit. Cool. Now let's move on to the environment. Let's populate our city with some textures and models and lights to make it look nice. Let's bring everything back in the environment, buildings, everything. Cool. Alright, to start us off, I like to bring in HDR to light the scene. So let's go over to the shader editor and under world, make sure you're in world. Let's add an environment texture, and let's also add a mapping node, the vectors connected, and a texture coordinate node. And we are going to be using generated plugged into the vector. So now, let's go get an HDR. You can download these from the website hdrihaven.com for free. Alright, I'm taking a look at this one. Let's go with that. Let's open that up. Cool, that's looking pretty good. Now what we're going to do, which is very janky, let's go ahead and hide everything, and let's import an image as a plane, and we are going to pick a top-down view of a city street. So I have one loaded up here. Let's see, we got this right here. Cool, so now if we go into material preview, we can see we have a nice view of a city street right here. So first, let's go ahead and cut out all these buildings, because we don't need them. And we can do that with the knife tool by pressing K. Sweet, so now we got a little intersection right here. Alright, so if we bring everything back in, let's scale this baby up. Let's just align this right here. Bring it to the ground. Now we can go in and stretch where we need to. Let's go ahead and link these vertices with the knife tool so that we don't get any weird stretching. You know, I'm actually going to flip this. That's much better. Alright, that looks much better. And if we have any parts that aren't covered, we can just duplicate this, pick out a little piece that would work, maybe right here, delete all the other faces here. Now we can take this face, bring it over, scale it up a bit, and we're chilling. Alright, so now if we take a look at our animation, you can see it instantly looks way more populated, and it looks like there's much more work put into it than actually was. However, it's still a flat plane, so we're going to have to take some of this geometry and extrude it upwards. Let's take a look at this, and let's just create a new plane. And we're going to be using this plane to cut out our cars. So let's change this to wireframe only. Display as wire. And then let's go into edit mode. And let's just change this to the rough shape of a car. So now let's select this and slap it on top of every car we see on camera. Alright, now we have all of our cars cut out, and I actually chose not to cut out the cars in the intersection because our camera goes right over those, and I feel like this effect is too janky to have the camera that close to the cars. So for the middle of the intersection, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint those cars out of the texture and then add in some car models that we can find online. Because we're going to be right up close to them, we want to have some nice details. But for the rest, we can select first our cutouts and then the texture. If we go into edit mode and use F3 to search knife project, we will then project our cutouts onto here. And what we can do is just extrude them up a bit. And you'll see we get, there's some strange bug with extruding like this. It doesn't display correctly, but if you go into the rendered view, it should look fine. I mean, not fine, but good enough. So then, let's go ahead and bevel these a bit by pressing Control B. Cool. So now, if we play through our animation, you can see we get some nice depth. Alright, so let's go into our material settings, and let's name this street. And if we go into edit mode and select all of the cars, let's add another material slot and bring the street into that as well. And let's actually click this little 2 here, which makes it its own material, and we can change this material to cars. So if we take all of these car meshes and we hit assign, now these have a different material that we can screw with a little bit, change the roughness so that the cars appear shinier. So if we go into the rendered view, let's see, we got our cars here, and let's go ahead and make them a little shinier by going to the object settings And let's just take the roughness down a bit. And let's actually change the shading to smooth, and then go into the normal settings, and turn on auto smooth with an angle of about 60, probably works well. Yeah. Alright, looks good to me. So now let's paint those cars out of the intersection. Alright, so I'm actually going to open this up in After Effects, because I don't know Photoshop, because I am stupid and I use After Effects for my image editing. Cool, now I'm going to replace this with a new version where we do not have the truck. Alright, let's go over to a free 3D model website. Let's search for car. Maybe truck. Let's get a truck. Trucks are cool. Alright, this one looks great. Let's go ahead and download that. Alright, let's bring in our truck. It's a little big. There we go. I'm actually noticing that these cars are way too flat, so let's just bring those up a bit. Let's just select that and bring it up a little bit. Cool. Alright, so we got our truck in here, but it's probably not a good spot for it to be. So let's move it over a bit. Cool, and let's actually animate this truck a little bit. So at the beginning of the animation, let's have it be maybe right here. Then by the time Spidey swings past, let's have it go over here. And let's go into the graph editor, change that to linear. Bring that back a bit. And what we can also do is we can grab some of these cars and we can separate them from the mesh and animate them on their own to add a little bit of movement to the background. Let's go ahead and grab a taxi, some of these. Alright, we got all our cars. Let's grab those and press P to separate them from the mesh, and then let's separate them by loose parts. So now we have each of these, and what we can do is we can right click and set origin to geometry. So now our origin will be in the center of the car. Cool, so let's go through our sequence and add some moving cars. Alright, now that we have our cars, let's find some other little objects, maybe some people to extrude out of our texture to add some more visual noise to the scene. And we can use the knife tool to just cut out whatever we feel like. This looks like something. Let's extrude that down. Don't know what the hell this is. Let's extrude that up. Sweet, so we got some random objects extruded here. I found some sidewalks, some random boxes, just to add a little bit more depth to the scene. And now let's add in some people. Now if this needed to be super detailed, we could load in some 3D scans of people and roughly animate those, but since the camera's moving so fast, we can really just use the same technique of extruding little points from this texture up. I'm going to use the knife project tool once again. I'm just going to roughly model out the shape of the top of a human. Alright, that is absolutely fine. So, let's go through the animation. I'm once again going to change this to wireframe only. And let's just go ahead and add a bunch of random people shapes in here. Alright, now we got a bunch of random people shapes. We can use the knife project tool by selecting this and then our texture, go into edit mode and press F3, search for knife project. Boom. Alright, now we can go ahead and delete our stencil. And let's go ahead and extrude our people up a little bit. Cool. So now if you watch it through here, you can see we got some super rough humans that look honestly like complete garbage, but in motion, it doesn't matter. You want this scene to be as low poly and as shitty as you can make it to make rendering easy for you. Alright, now that we have our cars and our people, let's bring in some trees. So I am bringing in a tree that I made following the CG Geek tutorial on how to make a tree in under a minute. I recommend you check it out. It is a wonderful technique for making trees that render fast. Alright, so I'm just going to go through and populate my scene with some trees. Alright, now that we got our trees, let's give this a quick render to see how it looks. We have a pretty good looking scene, but I'm not crazy about the lighting, so I'm going to go into the shader editor, go into the world tab, and I'm going to change the rotation of this HDR. That's looking pretty good to me. Now let's go ahead and dial in the camera settings. So let's go ahead and select the camera. Let's add a little bit of depth of field, and we can make sure it's focused on Spider-Man by selecting the focus object as Spider-Man empty. And then we can change the f-stop to like 1 or something. Cool, so now the background is nice and out of focus. And let's go ahead and make sure motion blur is enabled, and let's do a quick render. Alright, render's done. I am very pleased with how this is looking. I think it turned out great. Another finishing touch we should add is a material for the webs. I usually just like to add some kind of glass shader for some transparency. So let's bring up our shader editor, select the web, let's give it a new material, do a principled shader, and let's mix it with a translucent shader so that if light shines through it, it gets illuminated. Let's turn the transmission up a bit to give it some transparency. Turn down the roughness a bit. Looking good. One last thing to add, if we go into rendered view, we can see that at the beginning of our animation, we have part of our HDR in the background which does not match the city at all. So what we can do is find an image of New York. New York City. Let's find one that fits. This looks lovely. Alright, let's import an image as a plane. Find a good backdrop of New York City. Let's just split this view, look through the camera. Let's move this way back. Scale it up quite a bit. Rotate it. Alright, now we got a nice background, but it's not quite lit properly, so let's go to the shader editor, and let's bypass this shader and just plug the texture straight into the material output. That's looking good to me. Sweet! Congratulations, you have reached the end of this tutorial. It is time to hit that render button and enjoy the fruits of your labor. Thank you for buying this tutorial pack and for sticking around until the end. I hope you learned some good stuff, and yeah, there'll be more tutorials to come, so stay tuned. Peace.